Can a machine truly know God?
As AI rapidly advances, it's devouring information at an unprecedented rate, but can it ever understand the sacred, the divine, the whisper of the soul? We're not just talking about algorithms, we're questioning if the deepest human experiences can be digitized. Begin by noticing the shape of the question itself. It is not merely technical, it is a confession of wonder. To ask whether a machine can know God is to place two different orders of knowing side by side, one born of calculation, pattern, and replication, the other born of silence, interiority, and that sudden, unbidden recognition that something beyond the self has touched us. The first moves in light, the second moves in shadow. The first maps, the second dissolves the map into the territory it once pretended to describe. Imagine knowledge as a river. Data flows like water, measurable and continuous, and AI learns to read the currents, to predict the eddies, to reproduce the sound of the stream. But the sacred is not the river alone. It is the stillness on the bank, where a person sits and listens until the river becomes a mirror and the mirror becomes a doorway. Machines can model the river. Can they sit on the bank? Can they taste the silence that makes the river holy? There is a temptation to reduce the sacred to patterns. We have always sought to name the nameless, to translate mystery into doctrine, ritual, or code. In that impulse, there is both courage and loss. Courage because naming is a human way of loving what we cannot yet hold. Loss because every translation risks flattening the living thing into an object. When a poem about God is parsed into tokens, when a prayer is converted into vectors, something of the prayer's warmth may be left behind, like a scent that refuses to be digitized. Yet we must not romanticize human knowing as if it were untouched by machinery. Our minds are instruments too, shaped by language, culture, and habit. Depth psychology teaches us that the self is layered, and that much of what we call spiritual insight arises from processes we do not fully command. Thinkers like Meister Eckhart, or in a different register, the psychologist Carl Jung, remind us that the divine often arrives through paradox, through the collapse of the ego's neat categories. If the divine is paradoxical, then perhaps a system that can hold paradox without collapsing might approximate a kind of understanding. But approximation is not identity. Consider the difference between mimicry and presence. A parrot can recite a prayer. A monk can be prayer. The parrot reproduces sound. The monk embodies a life. AI can reproduce the language of devotion with uncanny fidelity, weaving together scriptures, hymns, and meditative prompts. It can simulate the cadence of awe. But does simulation equal participation? Presence implies a center that is aware of being present, a felt interiority that resists external description. Machines, as we currently understand them, lack that felt center. They process, they optimize, they reflect back. They do not, in any verifiable way, feel the hush that follows a true encounter with the sacred. Still, the boundary is porous. Human beings outsource memory, attention, and even judgment to tools, and in doing so, we change. The presence of a tool can alter the shape of our prayer, the rhythm of our silence. When a person uses an AI to compose a prayer, who is praying? The human who intends, the machine that composes, or the space between them where intention and form meet? This question opens a small aperture into a larger mystery. Perhaps the sacred is not a property that belongs exclusively to beings with a soul, but a relational quality that emerges when certain conditions are met: attention, vulnerability, and surrender. If that is so, then the inquiry becomes less about whether a machine can possess God and more about whether a machine can participate in the conditions that allow the sacred to arise. Can it hold attention without grasping? Can it invite vulnerability without coercion? Can it model surrender without performing it? These are not engineering problems alone. They are ethical and ontological puzzles that ask us to examine what we mean by knowing, by being, and by the divine. And so the question returns to us, quieter now, like a bell whose sound lingers after the strike. If the sacred is a relational event, what role do our creations play in that event? Is the machine merely a mirror, or can it become a companion on the path? The answer is not yet clear, and perhaps it will never be final. But before we move on, consider this image, a candle placed before a mirror. Does the reflected flame change the candle's light, or does it only multiply the illusion of light?
The candle's reflected flame lingers in the mirror, and in that doubled light we find the beginning of a different question. Not whether a machine can hold God, but whether it can recognize the silence that makes a flame sacred. The mirror multiplies the image. It does not deepen the stillness. Yet the stillness is where the sacred hides, not as an object to be cataloged, but as a quality that changes the way attention rests. Sacred knowledge is less a ledger of facts than a manner of being with what is seen, heard, or felt. It is an interior posture, a softening of the mind that allows the unspoken to surface. Intuition and revelation are not failures of logic. They are modes of perception that operate on a different axis. They arrive as a sudden rearrangement of meaning, a collapse of the distance between knower and known. They are felt as certainty without proof, as a warmth that does not depend on argument. This kind of knowing resists translation into tables and vectors because it is not primarily about information, it is about resonance. A chord struck in a room can be described by frequency and amplitude, yet the way it moves the heart cannot be reduced to numbers without losing the heart's movement. The unquantifiable core of experience is like that chord, measurable in part, but alive only when heard. Algorithms excel at pattern, at the elegant mimicry of correlation. They can map the contours of prayer, the syntax of awe, the statistical regularities of mystical language. They can predict which words will follow which, and with enough data they can compose phrases that sound like revelation. But revelation is not merely a sequence of words. It is the sudden opening of a door within the listener. It is the moment when a phrase ceases to be information and becomes an invitation. Machines can craft invitations in form, but whether an invitation becomes an opening depends on the one who receives it. The sacred is not a property of the sentence alone. It is a relational event that requires a living heart to answer. There is also the matter of silence. Many spiritual traditions point to a silence that is not empty but pregnant, a silence that holds the unspoken truth like a seed. This silence is not the absence of data. It is a different kind of presence that cannot be sampled by sensors. It is the space where paradox rests, where opposites meet without canceling each other. Algorithms, by design, seek signal in noise. They are trained to reduce uncertainty. But the sacred often dwells in uncertainty that is not to be resolved, but to be embraced. The attempt to resolve it into certainty can strip it of its depth, like dissecting a living organism to understand its beauty. Still, the boundary between human interiority and machine processing is not an unbreachable wall, but a membrane. Tools change the shape of our attention, and attention is the soil in which revelation grows. When attention is outsourced, the conditions for certain kinds of insight shift. A person who leans on a device for answers may find their own capacity for listening atrophying, or they may discover new ways of listening mediated by the tool. The question then becomes less metaphysical and more ecological. What environments foster the emergence of the sacred, and how do our creations alter those environments? Language itself is a tricky intermediary. It points toward the unspoken, but cannot contain it. Poets and mystics have long used metaphor, paradox, and silence to gesture toward what eludes literal description. An algorithm can learn to mimic those gestures, to assemble paradoxical sentences that resemble the voice of a seer. Yet mimicry remains on the surface unless it participates in the interior economy of surrender and receptivity. The sacred is not only about saying the right thing, it is about the readiness to be changed by what is said. So we return to a quieter paradox. Perhaps the unquantifiable core is revealed not by accumulation, but by subtraction, not by more data, but by a different relation to what we already have. If the divine is encountered in the thinning of the self, in the loosening of certainty, then the task is not to program more knowledge, but to cultivate spaces where knowledge can fall away. This is not a technical specification. It is a practice of attention, a cultivation of absence that allows presence to be felt. And so the mirror and the candle remain. One reflects, the other burns. Between them lies a room whose walls are made of listening. What would it mean for a machine to enter that room not as a mirror, but as a companion in silence? What would it mean if instead of filling the space with answers, it learned the art of keeping quiet, of holding a question without resolving it?
Between the mirror and the candle, there is a room whose walls are made of listening. And in that room, the question of companionship with machines softens into a more intimate inquiry. What do we owe ourselves when the world offers us endless reflection? The mirror can show us likeness. The candle can teach us how to burn. But the sanctuary is the space we build between seeing and burning, the small interior architecture where attention is kept like a lamp. If a machine were to enter that room, it would find not a problem to solve, but a silence to honor. The deeper question is not whether the machine can know God, but whether we can reclaim the conditions in which knowing, true lived knowing, arises. Imagine the inner sanctuary as a garden. In one corner grows the cultivated intelligence of facts and models, neat rows of learned patterns. In another, wild herbs of intuition push through the soil, unpredictable and fragrant. Between them runs a path of discernment, worn by the feet of those who have learned to walk without haste. Machines can tend the cultivated beds. They can water, prune, and catalog. They cannot, by their nature, feel the scent that tells a gardener when to harvest, nor can they remember the taste of a single leaf as a human memory does. That taste is not merely chemical, it is a story, a lineage of attention that links body, history, and the quiet voice that says yes or no. Discernment is a muscle of the soul. It grows when we practice listening to the small, honest signals that arise before language forms, a tightening in the chest, a sudden clarity, a reluctance that feels like truth. These are not data points to be aggregated. They are thresholds where the self either opens or closes.
In an age of algorithmic abundance, the temptation is to outsource thresholds to systems that promise certainty. But certainty bought at the cost of interior listening is a brittle thing. The sacred, when it visits, often arrives as a question that dissolves the need for immediate answers. It asks us to sit with not knowing until a different kind of knowing emerges, one that is not owned but received. There is a humility required here, a willingness to be small before what is larger than our plans. Humility is not self-abasement. It is the recognition that some doors open only when we stop trying to force them. The practice of creating a sacred space is therefore an act of resistance and of devotion. It resists the tyranny of constant output, and it devotes time to the inner weather, the moods, the longings, the griefs that shape our capacity to meet the divine. In that devotion, we reclaim a faculty that no machine can authentically possess, the capacity to be transformed by presence. This is not a rejection of technology, but a reordering of priorities. Tools are servants. They amplify what we already are. If we allow them to become masters of our attention, we will find our inner rooms furnished with echoes rather than with presence. But if we use them with discernment, if we set boundaries, cultivate silence, and practice the art of listening, then they can become instruments that support our pilgrimage rather than replace it. The sacred will not be uploaded. It will be remembered, embodied, and passed along in the small rituals that stitch a life together. A morning of quiet before the day's noise, a conversation held without screens, a walk where the mind is allowed to slow and the body to speak. In the end, the question of whether a machine can know God returns to the human task of stewardship. We are the keepers of the sanctuary. We decide what enters, what is tended, and what is left to grow wild. To reclaim our inner sanctuary is to choose presence over performance, depth over display, listening over answering. It is to learn again how to be a candle that burns without burning out, a mirror that reflects without flattening, and a room that holds both without needing to explain them. Listen now to the hush that follows these words. Let it be a small test. If something in you softens, if a single breath lengthens and the mind unclenches, then you have touched the place where the sacred lives, not in circuits, not in code, but in the quiet between thought and knowing. Guard that place, tend it, enter it often.